Good evening and welcome. I'm Valerie Cassell-Oliver. I am the Sidney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art. And on behalf of our director, Alex Nargis, and our Deputy Director for Exhibition and Programs, Dr. Michael Taylor, we just welcome you here tonight for the second program highlighting the works of Benjamin Wigfall and Communications Village. My job here is pretty simple. I'm just going to introduce our featured speakers this evening and invite them to the stage and let them do what they do, which is pretty exciting. First, I'd like to also recognize that there's one last program, which is August 11th, which would be with our Dr. Sarah Eckhardt and her co-curator, Drew Thompson, as well as some of the members, early members of Communication Village, who will be here and will be able to feature their voices. If you have not seen Benjamin Wigfall and Communications Village, please do so. It's such a treat and such a testament to the work of our very own Dr. Sarah Eckhardt. So I'll do the honors of introducing her since she's the moderator this evening. Dr. Eckhardt joined the VMFA in 2011. Straight out of Houston, which is a wonderful through line here, with myself being from Houston and Mel Edwards being from Houston. So it's fairly exciting to have that kind of geographic connection and for us all to be here in Richmond, Virginia. She came to us from the de Menil collection, but prior to that was at the Cranart Art Museum, where she had mounted a retrospective of work by Hedda Stern in 2006. Since she's been here at the VMFA, she has organized several exhibitions, Identity Shifts in 2014, but what I think highlights her strength and her major contributions to this institution is exemplified in the exhibition Kamoinge, Louis Draper Kamoinge Workshop Working Together, which was mounted in 2020 and traveled extensively, traveled to the Whitney and to the Getty and to the Cincinnati Art Museum. Not only did it expand our holdings of photography through the members of Kamoinge Workshop, but it also really expanded our archives. And this is something which is really quite striking that she has been bringing to our institution. Benjamin Wigfall Working Together also not only expanded our holdings of works that are featured in the exhibition by Wigfall and by members of his community, meaning those artists who came in residence, but also the extensive archives of Benjamin Wigfall, both Louis Draper and Wigfall being Virginia natives, Richmonders. So it's quite astounding what we have been able to do through her acumen and through her sheer willpower. So thank you, Dr. Sarah Eckhardt, for that. Our featured speakers that she will be speaking with is Mel Edwards, who is an amazing pioneer in the field of contemporary art and is specifically looking at sculpture. We had already in our holdings Lynch Fragment, which Sarah brought into the collection, but then also Corner for Anna, or Anna's Corner. We keep vacillating between the title, but it also, one of the things that really piqued our interest in bringing that work into the collection was because of our own beloved Anna right here in our city and the amazing work that she's been doing. But his work is exemplified through those works. And if you haven't seen the exhibition, you should, because Corner for Anna is actually featured in the exhibition. And it's really quite beautiful installed where it is. Melvin Edwards was born and raised in Houston, Texas, where he began his artistic career. He went to the University of Southern California and later to Yale University, and then taught at Rutgers for roughly 30 years, from 1972 to 2002 when he retired. He has been the recipient of a Guggenheim exhibition, has been the subject of a number of exhibitions. Probably the most outstanding was Melvin Edwards' 5 Decades, which was mounted in 2015 by the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, Texas. His work was also featured in the 56th Venice Biennale in 2015 and the Havana Biennale in 2019, and most recently in Afro-Atlantic Histories. If you did not see that in Washington, D.C., I can say it is an astounding exhibition. With that, I'll move on to Ana Edwards, his daughter, who is a public historian and museum educator working with the American Civil War Museum right here in the city. She's also the chair of Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, which was a 2004 initiative of Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equity. She has done incredible work here, specifically around the history of Black community here in Richmond, Virginia, looking at the principle, centering around the principle for the right of oppressed peoples toward self-determination. Her works protect and elevate Black history through advocacy and scholarship. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speakers to the stage.
Well, thank you, Valerie, for the very generous introductions. And I want to thank Valerie because she, one of the beautiful confluences in this exhibition about Benjamin Wigfall and Communications Village is, in fact, this piece, Anna's Corner. As you know, Benjamin Wigfall, or may or may not know, Benjamin Wigfall grew up here in Churchill and before moving to New Paltz, and then founding Communications Village in Kingston. But when Valerie arrived, and also coming from Houston, as Mel Edwards was born and raised in Houston, she set forward a major acquisition from this series as one of her first priorities. And so this was a work she acquired very early, and it was really, I'm going to flip forward. You can see here a close-up, a detail of the barbed wire. We did not know that yet, that in his residency at Communications Village, Mel Edwards had made his print using the barbed wire, and so it was just this beautiful piece to discover in the midst of the research on Communications Village to find that Valerie, in a sense, confirmed Benjamin Wigfall's taste with her early desire to have a significant work by you in the collection. But I actually want to start with you, because one of the things we loved about this work, although Valerie was thinking about the barbed wire series, and that was the particular series she wanted to acquire a work from for the museum, the fact that it was named for you and that you are so beloved here in this community and have done so much work as a community organizer and a public historian and all of the things which Valerie mentioned, I've never gotten to ask you what you think of this work.
My initial response to this work actually came in 2015 at the Nasher Museum, because when was that made? 1970. I was 10 years old. I'm not sure that I was aware of it at all. And so it was, it wouldn't have been, right? So anyway, we walked into the early moments of the reception for the opening of the exhibition, and people kept saying hi, and I hadn't seen you in a long time. Have you seen it? And I'm like, what? And they're saying, oh, you have to go see it. And I'm like, what? And then, so as I'm moving along, and then finally bump into you, and then you take me down, and I see this, and I see the title, and I just laughed. We just laughed and laughed and laughed. So that was my response.
Thank you. That's not the response I expected. So maybe you can tell us now a little bit more about the series, how you conceived it, what it was about.
Well, the title of the work is actually Anna's Corner. The making of the piece really had nothing to do originally with Ana at all. As, no, you'll have to understand, I'm a sculptor. You know, I'm a father, that's true. 1970, actually, Anna and that part of my family, they were all in California. And the exhibition, which was a one-man show at the Whitney Museum, and what they wanted from me originally at the Whitney was some of the welded steel works that I was already fairly known for, the lynch fragments. I told Robert Doty, the curator, no, I had been developing some other ideas, and I thought it more important to show them. And they are the barbed wire geometries that I developed, which had their own dynamics and changed with any space that they might be in. The exhibition had a barbed wire curtain, which ultimately, as far as titles go, excuse me, as far as titles go, was named A Curtain for William and Peter, which were William Williams and Peter Bradley, who were two artists who were friends of mine, and I had shared their studio in a period when I was out of a place to live. And they were artists who, through the years, to this day, they are dear friends. And so the titling simply was to thank them. The dynamics of the sculpture, to me, were clear and dynamic. And that was what I wanted my work to be in that period. That's why the geometric approach. Anyway, there was the curtain, and then there was the double pyramid. That is a pyramid that was divided in terms of its geometric drawing, where the apex on one side is up, and divided by a wall, the apex is down. So when you're looking at it at a certain direct angle, you get almost an optical illusion visually. In other words, I'm always very conscious that what I'm working with is visual art. You know, people can play with the meanings because I play with them as well. You know, but in terms of the dynamics of developing work, I have my own internal systems that I move around, you know, in order to make what I hope are works that are unique to my ways of thinking. And they have their own relationship to the art world, the world of nature, you know, and anybody else who goes by. And if anybody's ever seen a dog go by it down the street and there's a sculpture and a base, often you'll find little stains all along the base. So I know that public art is subject to public realities, you know. This has already taken, you see, a long way away from Anna. The title came because in constructing the other works, there turned out to be a L-shaped corner of the museum exhibition area that I thought it would make a perfect prism, P-R-I-S-M, okay. And in relation to that, I do play with language, sound, and stuff like that. And so after working on it a while, I said, this prism can be a form of prism, you know, and stuff. Somewhere in there, because it was a corner, I remembered, and I have no intuitive or real reason why to remember that, oh yeah, the corner. Yeah, I used to send Anna to the corner when she misbehaved, you know. But there was no barbed wire, there was no, you know. But as you all can understand in human terms, you make a person stay in one place that's not the place of their choice, and they don't feel good, you know. And they do think about why they're there, you know. And any parent knows that's what you try and do with your children. So that's the father-daughter part, you know. So that was 1970, and she said she never saw it for many years. So, you know, and I played more with the form notions of prism, P-R-I-S-M, and the idea subjectively of a prison, which has its way of manipulating or confining spatially human ideas. You know, because when people are in prison, human ideas are being imprisoned, are being manipulated. It's not simply just, well, he did something wrong and he's in jail. You know, there's much more to that. Anybody in law or psychology knows those things.
And can you perhaps explain a little bit about the conceptual nature of the work, which is that when we acquired this, we did not acquire barbed wire. Mm-hmm. We acquired your drawing and your idea, which is very specific, and tell me if I have it wrong. We could buy barbed wire with varying spacing between the barbs, so long as so long as you see the eyelets in the wall are spaced the same distance as between the barbs, and then we go as low to the floor and as high to the ceiling, but we can vary how far out on the wall so long as it's equal, makes an equal triangle.
Well, more or less, I would say more or less that's what I try and do. But, you know, I've done things differently. I'm not that rigid about those things because one of the things about sculpture, art, space, architecture, all of those things is you can describe something and plan something one way, but when you actually see it or experience it, you may prefer to do it or another variant of the notion. And I also like variations on ideas. In other words, I would say, if I have to say where a liking of that kind of notion, that probably comes from my interest in music. And I'm not a musician, and I have no capacity or very little in that direction. I've been stopped from singing many times when I was young, so nobody's ever had to worry about that.
So I thought then maybe this would be a good moment to think a little bit more about Communications Village, because just in the same way that Valerie very clearly thought your work was a really important addition to our permanent collection, you were one of the early artists that Benjamin Wigfall invited, along with Jane Cortez, to Communications Village, which I'll just describe a little bit more what Communications Village was. So after Benjamin Wigfall had moved, he was a professor at Hampton, grew up in Churchill, came to the museum, went to school at Hampton University, left, got a degree at Yale, came back and taught at Hampton, then left in 1963 to teach at the State University of New York, New Paltz. And then after about 10 years there, which was when he began, he was the only black faculty member, and so he was thinking a lot about how African-American culture informed his work, or how much he would like it to inform his work. So he sought out the community in Kingston for a studio. His studio, as he rehabbed it, it was a building here, brick livery stable. The teens nearby started to help him renovate it. And then as it became a printing press, as he brought in the printing presses, the idea sort of took shape that he would train the students in how to make prints. Not necessarily, he wasn't as interested in training them how to make their own prints. He wanted to train them on how to use the printing press to be able to make the prints for artists. And that was the next concept. He wanted to invite what he called the outstanding black artists of his day. That was how he talked about the program when he wrote about it, to Kingston. And he wanted the kids to not have to leave their own community to meet these artists. He wanted to bring the artists to them. He wanted the artists themselves to engage in the community there, so that the work that they formed and made at Communications Village came out of that community. And then he wanted the students themselves to print it, and he wanted the exhibition of the work to be there for the community. So that kind of gives you all a sense of what Communications Village was. Mm-hmm. But when he spoke about the Visiting Artist Program, your artist residency, along with Jane Cortez, was really one of his primary models. So I wondered if you could tell us, from your perspective as an artist who came on that residency, what it was like, maybe how you met him and how that residency worked.
Well, it's funny hearing it in formal terms like a residency.
Yeah.
Ben and I had become friends because of, we were introduced by Ernest Critchlow, the painter. Any number of New York area artists often summered in upstate New York, and I can't remember the exact reason, but somehow I met Ben there through Ernie. In that period, roughly 1970 to 72, 70, 71, 72, I was teaching at the University of Connecticut. Ben really wanted me to come over and teach and work with him at New Paltz, and he worked hard at it and almost had it worked out. I got an offer from Rutgers University and didn't do it, and Ben wasn't happy with me, but it was a better situation for me, and I understood what Ben was about in relation to community. I didn't have that level of commitment. I had my own notion of how I best could do things for community. No way is invalid, but you find your own path to being functional. And I've always been, or tried to do things that way. But anyway, Ben asked me if Jane and I could do something. And as I had done the drawings for her first couple of books, he thought that was appropriate. Her own background was actually in high school years, she was an art major, a music major. She played cello in the orchestra, things like that. She knew how to compose directly, but she also had very specific notions of composition, possibilities of composition, improvisation. Well, you can take those same words and put them in the visual art, and they're functional just as well. And some people, and she was one who she was profound in that way. In any case, in that week of our residency there, we worked it out, and the linear life aspect of the prints is really a kind of interpretive idea of a page has lines on it. Lines either based on just the words, or if you've got a high school notebook, they've already got the lines there so your writing doesn't wander, that kind of thing. But anyway, in terms of visual art, variance and things not being the same or very straight line geometry can give you other qualities. And that's what I was doing in relation to that. In relation to the words, in relation to things, Jane played with them the way she would. So those verbal lines were another, it's like if we were both in music, it'd be, two different instrumentalists. If we were both in something else, again, it's a complementary relationship. That's what we worked for or trusted. I did the lines and the words were up to her. I put no limits on her, and she put none on me. And then Ben, as the master printer, and the people he worked with, they had some freedom as well, and that's why the artist proofs were important and the variants. And I liked really the idea that there could be many variants, And for instance, the creativity even extended to the title, Carolina Kingston. Well, what's that? Well, Carolina was where most of the African-American peoples who were in upstate New York, they'd come from the southern states as migratory workers that were seasonal. And by the end of the seasons of labor for them, they were in upstate New York, And many of them then remained in the region. Ben often was in the situation of teaching the children of those people. I had taught for a couple of years nearby in Middletown, New York, and so I got people who were from the same backgrounds, and I learned about the history of the region that way. And I say I learned about the history of the region, but I had my prior understanding based on my interest in the Last of the Mohegans and James Fenimore Cooper and the region and the Glimmerglass and just all kinds of things that already were playing. So when you look at this one group of prints, they can't tell you all that, but all of that is stuff that's bubbling up inside of me to move around and to handle. In other words, it's like you buy all the colors at the paint store, and then there are the ones that you end up with on the surface of what you're working with, you know. I don't know, I can, as you can tell, I can mumble. I'm an old school teacher, I'll run.
But it's Carolina Kingston, and she also then connected Carolina Kingston all the way back to Angola, Africa.
Yeah, that, and also Kingston is, I think it was the first capital of if not the United States or the region. It came from, the wording came from England, you follow. The region is New England, and it's important to understand that in that period, that was it. That was the United States and that sort of thing. But there's a Kingston, Jamaica, you know. So in other words, the variants of people's cultures are always being manifest and developed, sometimes with things as formal as that, and other times absolutely independently, and it's just mama's cooking, you know, it's just how to make black beans, you know, and rice, you know.
Well, and that's something the students remembered about Ben, coming from Virginia. The students did not know their parents' own history in Virginia and the Carolinas, but Ben did, and he liked their mother's cooking. So they said he would stop by because that was something that was very familiar.
Yeah. Well, you know, for me, Ben, he just was a very special person. We became good friends. Ben was probably more active at both the friendships and the way he interacted with people, you know, regionally. One of the first teachers or artists that I worked with in Middletown, Anthony Panzera, had been a student of Ben's, and Anthony was from a Italian family that had, I think, migrated in around the 1920s or 30s to that region, and they liked being upstate, not in the cities, and that sort of thing, because of their interest in agriculture. He turned out to be a specialist in the dynamics of the approaches of Leonardo da Vinci. If you look up that name, Anthony Panzera, and you know, Google, you'll find a book, and it's incredibly significant and precise. And he had a way of utilizing principles of da Vinci for contemporary drawings of his. And there's one drawing of me that he did. He passed 3 or 4 years ago, and a few months ago, his widow asked me if I'd like a drawing that he'd done of me, and this very large drawing of me arrived, and it was, I remember he'd come to my studio and done the drawing, you know, that kind of thing. Well, that's a connection to Ben, because, and then Panzera became a professor at Hunter College in New York, and one of my other daughters was there at Hunter College, and she wanted to take a trip to Italy in the summer, and I, as a reluctant father, wasn't saying yes too quick. I'd been telling her, go meet Mr. Panzera, he's a family friend, he knew you when you were little, and she, of course, didn't do it. All of a sudden, she showed up one day saying, Dad, I met Mr. Panzera, and he's head of the Italian trip. Daughters know how to take care of fathers. But anyway, what I'm getting at, and no, he reassured me that it was a positive, creative, and developmental set of activities that were going on. And in fact, he had his own children who'd been part of programs like that. So communications.
There you go. So, and I just wanted to point out behind me, this is Communications Village, the building. This was made by an artist named Rose Tripoli, who photographed the architecture of the Pankaki neighborhood around Communications Village, and then photographed Communications Village. And then she made this object is in the exhibition, and it's really one of my favorite, besides your sculpture, one of my favorite archival items. Because you can see that the doors and windows are open, and you can see the figures behind them, and you have Bob Blackburn in the center, Pat Jow, Charles Gaines, you, and Jane Cortez, I think, are all featured in, so it gives you that sense of community, and the kind of, not that all of these artists were always or rarely there at one time, if ever there at one time, but that he connected that network frequently through friendships and...
Yeah. I would say he understood communication both at the local and the more extended relationships that we all have, and how at various times one aspect is helpful and at another time it's other aspects. You know, it didn't have to be a hard line, you know, notion. That village, any village in the world in relation to human beings, is ultimately something that's perennial with human beings. That's why we gather in villages. That's why no matter what definition of things when we use the term family, it can mean any number of variant ways of being developed, of being utilized, of being functional. And the person who runs it now, Andrew Light, who has that building, is an artist who's from Guyana in South America. And I remember when he was trying to get the building, and he needed sort of a personal recommendation, otherwise Ben wasn't going to sell it to him. And I turned out to be the middleman, saying that Andrew was a very good person, artist, responsible. And Andrew is an incredible craftsman himself, a very fine artist himself. Anyway, they worked it out. And if you were to go there and see the building now, you'll see that it's done very well. However, Andrew doesn't do the Communications Village interaction aspect. You know?
That's probably one of the most frequently asked questions about the project. Communications Village ended in 1983. So the building is still there, and it is Andrew's studio, but Communications Village essentially it's a story, and this might be a good segue to you. It's a story, I think, a little bit about the importance, well, a lot about the importance of public funding and grant money and the ways that those can ebb and flow. And in the 1970s, there was more available grant funding, and Ben was able to really network and put together a number of grants, and in the 1980s there was less grant funding and more competition for it. So I'm going to combine those two things to talk about our village here in Richmond and our community, public support for work happening here, and tell us now, Anna, more about what you do here, and also maybe if you could tell us how any of that might have been informed growing up with this guy as your dad. And I can, if you want to pace it, I can.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it was interesting because you sent me the questions and said, how did that piece inform my being a public historian or the work here? And I wrote like 8 different responses to it because it just triggered, sort of so many different things. One of them was, well, it couldn't. It's an anachronistic question. It just couldn't have influenced it at all. But on the other hand, one of the other questions was, how do you feel about your father's work, or what do you think of it? And I have always loved my father's work. And I know that you think a daughter will just say that stuff. But I think partly probably because of, even as a child, sort of growing up and the people around him, and there were artists around and writers around. And so I grew up with a pretty strong sense that what he was doing was significant in the world. And when I would look at the lynch fragments, because those are the pieces that I probably saw the most, except for some of the large-scale public work, I knew that there was something really strong happening there. And so, and then, you know, yes, he's a dad, and I avoided choosing art as a path because I wasn't sure if I had that or had anything to say that way. But I did eventually go to art school, and there were things that I hear him talking about now, about the work that I recall him talking to me about in the making of work. And those things certainly stay with me and remind me of, okay, what do they remind me of? The things that he impressed upon me, I felt, from the travels, from talking about how the world is made, how people interact, as you talk about how people interact with each other, what makes people do things that they do. I think I always was an observer and very interested in watching people and how why they do what they do, whether it's good things or bad things. And I think in the back of my head was always his voice in relation to him traveling to Africa in the 1970s, sending, you know, jewelry and fabric and books, coming back with stories. All of those things gave me a really strong sense that the world was this really big place that should be seen in order to understand how people are, because just by looking at our own little tiny village, we sort of get a kind of a concentrated and overly centric view of how people do things. So, I mean, you see, I am his daughter, as you can tell.
This is fantastic.
But the coming into doing community activism was in part because I always had heard and felt and gleaned from my dad, but also from my aunts and uncles, because they were our primary influences growing up, was that there were things to be done in the world, and that we all had to sort of come and figure out what our part in that was going to be. So, so I think those voices played a big part in me finally coming to activism, and then through the activism really discovering that history and the stories, right, are what make you tick and connect the dots.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Because you're clearly related. So tell us a little bit more, Ben.
Just a little bit on that part. As I remember Anna, you know, as a little girl and as a young woman, you know, growing and her own interests, you know. And first of all, her mother was very much an artist, you know, so that kind of interest was always there. And as we were divorced when Anna was around 8 or 9 years of age and stuff, so much of the input was not me directly, but our family, you know. And when she mentioned the political activist part, my sister, who was a member of CORE and an activist who went off to Louisiana and, you know, worked on the integration of things there. And that was common among people that we knew. Jane Cortez had gone to Mississippi and was a member of SNCC, who reported back to Los Angeles. And the designer neighbor, where when Anna was just born, was a man named Bob Rogers, a clothing designer. who happened to be half a block away, and his own place became the center for the SNCC organization in Los Angeles. And you met a variety of people who were politically involved, and often people visited that place because of Bob's charisma, I guess, but also his interaction. He was designing cloth for clothing and sending those designs to Oaxaca in Mexico, and they were woven to his standards in Mexican cotton and then brought back. In those days, an African-American designer in the fashion world was given no play. But Bob was known at the personal level, because it was Los Angeles, to people in Hollywood. There was a Life magazine photograph of Charles Lawton on vacation, and he's wearing Bob Rogers clothes, you know, that kind of thing. What I'm getting at is there's a community of activist persons or people who just cared, you know, about life and talked about it. And it was also the era of, well, you would say beatniks or things like that. And I use that term because we lived in a little house on an alley, and it was a back house to larger houses. But at the 3 o'clock or so in the afternoon, the kids who were out of school would shortcut their way through the alley. And one day I was inside, and Anna was sitting out. We had her, she was still not walking yet, sitting on a high chair so she could, you know, enjoy the outdoors and people going by. And then I heard the kids going by, a couple of them said, "Hi, beatnik baby, hi." You know? And they didn't see me, so they didn't know that I heard. And I laughed. I said, you know, you see, you get expressions and understanding of society by reality, you know, and that kind of thing. Well, we were not beatniks or anything like that. We were, you know, but in that sense, but you know, that they had their own interpretation of what they thought was going on. And I'm saying it that way because that part of Los Angeles fed a lot of creative people in a lot of directions. And it got better known later. South Central, it's not really near Central, but it's south in the north-south configuration of Los Angeles. And anyway, she was a part of it and received more than we knew. You know?
As is reflected here in Richmond, which is not a connection. I don't think people are often thinking about South Central Los Angeles in the 1960s as they're thinking about your work here in Richmond, Virginia now.
No.
So tell us a little bit more about this return to art school and connection of art and community engagement.
So I did not return to art school. I went the first time, and I did get my, I got my bachelor's degree in visual arts, and I did a couple of years of work at Rutgers University at Mason Gross School of the Arts. And I think I just, at that point I just got confused and distracted by life, really. And so I got married, and I married somebody at that school who was from Virginia, so that got me here in 1988. And I started a family and, you know, went through various things. But it really wasn't until the after my divorce, I realized that I sort of needed to situate myself in Richmond for my son, for my child. And one of the things I was trying to figure out was, how do I, sort of as a new parent on my own, how do I demonstrate my values as I raise a child? And so it made me look around at doing volunteer activities and trying to sort of look at what was going on around. And in addition to that, I was kind of ticking up a list of experiences that I had had in Virginia from the moment I moved here until that point. And for me, it was a lot of sort of surreal experiences. When I first moved here and I was being driven around by my husband and his family, I remember being really struck by how segregated it was. And that was because I grew up in this part of Los Angeles and in this time in Los Angeles where we had lots of people from many places all around us all the time. And my family, my mother, my father, were always really interested people. And in fact, I was fortunate that my grandparents were also people who were really interested in the world and other peoples and other cultures. So, you know, we were in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is really little Mexico. And then it also happens to be Little Tokyo, and it was also Chinatown, and it was, you know, and it was the art world, and there was a Jewish community, and you know, so I grew up with all of that as my norm, and then I came to Virginia in 1988, and for people who, oh my gosh, this place. So geographically, Richmond ended at Pemberton Avenue, and some of you know what that is. I think there's still a Haynes furniture store there. In 1988, after Pemberton Avenue, there was fields. It was all still farmland. You have to go another 25 miles to find some farmland now, because it's all been developed in the time that I've been here. But so at that moment, then, you know, old ways of being in Richmond and in Virginia were still very, very close. And so I had lots of experiences because people were responding to the fact that I was a mixed race young woman here, and people, and for me looking sort of around at this world, it felt very old, you know, at the same time that it felt very contemporary. My experiences were so limited at that point that it all felt very literary and like I was moving through the books that I had read. And really not to, well, I guess it had been 10 years at that point, but with the last English literature class that I took in college in probably 1982 was a Southern literature course, which was the most terrifying set of books I ever read in my life, because they all turned out to be Southern Gothic authors, right? Tennessee Williams and all these names I can't remember. Say it again. Faulkner, and there was another one who I really loved, but it's just all equally terrifying. It seemed like everybody died on the road or in the woods or behind the woodshed, or there was anyway. So I'm walking and moving around Virginia, and feeling like all of those things were lurking, you know, sort of just beyond the porches and all that. And on the one hand, I didn't like the idea that it fed into other bad movies that were all driven on stereotypes. I'm not interested in stereotypes, but it was nonetheless, I'd read those books at developmental moments, so they live, you know, in my head. But so that, the way people were responding to me as a mixed race person, and then the way that I saw people responding to my children as I was growing, and then just beginning to get a sense of the history specifically of Richmond versus the history of Chesterfield County versus Hanover County. And as I began to sort of pick up on those things, and the fact that it was that the history around me, even if I didn't know it very well, was clearly, palpably, very much alive. And that people were living with the consequences of it, but also in the present moment, navigating and negotiating what those things all meant. And so gradually, the next chapter shows up, but I'll take a pause so you can ask more questions.
Well, I just wanted to respond because, you know, I came here in 2005 because my husband got a job at VCU and we knew nothing about Richmond, and we got off 95 and we hit Stonewall Jackson, and I said, what have we done? I had no idea. And went through a similar process because I wasn't working here yet. But one of the things that I noted or I felt how palpable it was, living in Churchill and the monuments, but there was very little to in any way make the African American history present. And that is something that you shifted, and I felt it shift between, so could you talk a little bit about that process of how long it took as your, and when did you feel that there, not that there isn't a lot more work to do, but when did you begin to feel that shift occurring?
Well, okay, so in 2002, I was, I think, oh gosh, what was it? Okay, so I met my husband-to-be in 2002, and he was already a long-time activist. He's right there, Phil Waledo. So, and I was, he talked about things that sort of resonated with me in terms of, like I said, the experiences, the way that I was seeing history sort of playing out and making me more and more curious. But I also had recently attended a lecture by a woman named Audrey Smedley. She was an anthropology professor at VCU, and it was there that I learned for the first time about Gabriel's Rebellion. And the fact that in her book was about race and how race came to be a thing in the United States. And in the lecture, she talked about the fact that Gabriel's Rebellion was an event that took place at a moment that kind of allowed it to create a tipping point for the solidification of race as a viable justification for the enslavement of a specific group of people, right? So from this moment forward, we're not going to equivocate anymore for all of what the United States and its political leadership and its political thinkers at that time, sort of vacillated for a few seconds after the Revolutionary War about whether or not slavery was something the United States should continue to participate in. There are lots of events that lead to the recognition that this was going to be an extremely useful tool. So we are going to concretely go forward and codify the laws that make being black mean that you are an enslaved person in this society. And that if you are white, you are a free person in this society. And so acknowledging all the variations that happen, the fundamental assumption is that paradigm. And so once that becomes clear, then we go into the 19th century, and we go into that period of history that really is the period that we can, in the present day, look back to and see our origins in terms of how this society has evolved and what it looks like today, right? It sort of, to me, begins sort of in that period. And so her lecture for me, it was remarkable because I had been doing all this observing and thinking mostly inside my head, not having lots of conversations with people, and so not having a lot of words to what I was feeling and thinking about things. And so her lecture put words to my thoughts for the first time. And then not long after that, I met Phil, and he was already sort of doing things. He had only recently come to Virginia, but he was already involved in doing things. And so as we were getting to know each other and I was being exposed to that kind of direct political activism and engagement, we realized that, yes, they're the big ideas, but there are the local issues. And so it was the local issues that we began to see, or that I began to see, that needed that articulation and the connection to the historical context. Because we kept encountering people saying, I don't understand either why things are the way they are, or there isn't anything we can do about the things the way they are. And I mean, I know that that's not true for everyone. I'm just saying that it was part of what made me curious to want to figure out what it was about this history of Gabriel's Rebellion in that period that so energized me, that it might also energize other people in relation to it. And so eventually what that became, besides forming the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, was returning to the story of Gabriel's Rebellion because it took place or would have taken place here in the city of Richmond. And then it connected us to a scholar who had been doing research and working on trying to make people aware of the existence of that first municipal burying ground in Shockoe Bottom. And as we worked on that, it also provided a way to talk about a lot of other issues that also come out of that history. And some of the earliest issues that we worked on were prison reform and the issues of how the Richmond City Jail was being managed and what it was that people were going through once they are exposed to the criminal justice system. And then from that, it sort of just keeps going out. But I'll say that the key thing, you had the other slide up before with the newspaper on it.
Yep.
Right. So once we really decided that we wanted to work on helping to amplify the story of the rebellion and the burial ground, building on Phil's particular skill set as a journalist, he was working at the Richmond Free Press. We decided that following a series of public forums that we decided we needed to create a mechanism to communicate with the public on a regular basis. And so the same year that this newspaper, the Richmond Defender, as it was known then, came out, we were also doing this at the same time that a brand new community radio station was being formed. So everybody knows WRIR. Yes, go ahead. It's a pretty amazing development. But so they were getting together and they asked us if we could come up with a couple of like 2-minute programs, and then they said, no, we need you for 30 minutes. So in 2005, we started the newspaper, which was monthly and then quarterly, and then the weekly radio show, which we did for 9 years. And that gave us a vehicle for amplifying the community issues and always being able to sort of reconnect it to the historical context that Richmond specifically provided.
And when did the marker go up for Gabriel's Rebellion?
The marker went up in 2004, October of 2004. And that had actually in part been the result of a public forum that we had done to talk about what was happening in Haiti at that moment. And this was shortly after President Aristide had been summarily removed from office. So we wanted to talk about Haiti in the present moment, talk about the Haitian Revolution and its relationship to Gabriel's Rebellion and the geopolitical state of Virginia in that moment. And so in the course of doing that, which was, yes, it was all that. It was really, even as we were doing it, we were realizing that it was something a little bit new in terms of talking about a local issue and an international issue that people thought they couldn't understand. And yet, actually they could when given the right information.
It's true. No, I'm thinking history, thinking relations, thinking the personal experiences Anna is talking about. Clearly, she's capable of doing what she's doing and more, but nobody needs to be overloaded with things to do, work to do. And often that's what happens. Within the family, if I can speak that way, my father was a certain kind of activist, but he worked in Texas as a Republican, not the kind of Republicans we're talking about now. It was the election of Eisenhower, in fact, and very few Republicans in Texas in that period. The next generation that moved that way, were set into office. And in the black community, there were as much Democrats as white people were. However, they were not Dixiecrats, and that distinction really meant something in that place. My father's life took him to Dayton, Ohio as a functionary for the Boy Scouts of America. And when I say functionary, I don't mean a scoutmaster. I mean a person working in the office organizing the region in relation to things. But he and another friend, a man named Fred Bowers, got involved in the local African-American politics because they were feeling left out of the kind of politics that were Midwestern and developing there. And they formed, if my memory, because I was only 12 years old or so at the time, but whatever they did and my father's participation in it got him basically removed from the administrative work he was doing for the Boy Scouts. And eventually it caused us to move back to Texas. We had been in Ohio for 5 years. Our families were learning things that in their own way, in their own time, relate to what Anna's been doing. I think in the early 50s, then that friend of my father's, Mr. Bowers, became the first black person elected to the Ohio State House of Representatives and stuff. When I saw Mr. Bowers 30 years later, he said, you know, your father left Ohio too soon and stuff. But Ohio wasn't working out for him and our family. And typical of Texas people and Louisiana, they tended to migrate west. That's why ultimately I was in California, and many members of our family in that culture had moved that way. There was an anthropologist at Rutgers who investigated the African origins of African American people in Louisiana and traced them back to places like Guinea, because Mobile and New Orleans were a part of the French trade, route. Well, people were the primary commodity, and also the peoples of Haiti, and Haiti, of course, was a French colony which fought and got its own independence early, in the 1800s. As a consequence of that, many of the French people who were involved in agriculture and other kinds of things, they moved with their property, meaning slaves and stuff, to Louisiana, okay. Things moved around a bunch of ways in Louisiana, and the Louisiana Purchase then became a part of the United States, That whole set of, what do I call them, seemingly impersonal realities, historical, add up to people being in California, growing up, experiencing California as it was, as Anna described, but people don't understand that Texas was Mexico, in that earlier period. And when I grew up and was a child in Houston, my little dead-end street, the kids that I played with were the Mexican family, the Sierra family across the street from me. It was Enrique, Angelina, and Melvin, or Melvi. And it was often, Melvi, andale, go home. Because we played so much together, we were either a problem at their house or at my house. I'm giving that kind of explanation because the history that produced what we do now is often not understood, not known. People don't know that in the 1830s, before the people from Tennessee and that part of the United States came and defeated the Mexicans, that that slavery didn't exist in Mexico for about 15 or 20 years, because the Mexican Revolution, led by Morelos, and Morelos is on the peso, but that separated Mexico from Spain. Texas was a part of Mexico then. It was Tejas. It was like Mexico was Mexico. So the peoples of the region always had their dynamics and thinking going on, whether we got the information from experience or from writing, or that kind of thing. So when Ana describes Los Angeles, it's a complicated mix of the same thing. Well, you come back here to the eastern United States, and it had its own evolutions, and I say that plurally because they're the ones, we experience in our lifetime, and then the ones that people experienced before, and the ones that will come, And I always liked the idea that Ana was working on Shako Bottom, and restoration, and talking about that slaves were received, at various places here on the river. And then I have a picture of Ana and my sister Anne on a ferry in Senegal, and the Isle of Gorée is in the background of the photograph. So here, two descendants of all of that, seeing it for the first time, but Ana's father owns a house there in Senegal now, In other words, the family has made the circle back, and going on to do other things, Well, that's not just true of my family or, us. It extends to a lot of people doing a lot of things in a lot of ways that hopefully move the world forward. And when I say it that way, when we talk of visual art, we talk of the aesthetics. Well, the human aesthetics of humanism are the primary ones for human beings to develop. So an art museum or a city are museums of the activities or potentially creative of a society. And everybody can be a part of it. And my daughter, this one, is, in my opinion, is a good example of it. But she's got two sisters who are just as active in their own ways in relation to education, in relation to American finance, in relation to the society that we live in, My wife, Diala Touré, Dr. Diala Touré, is an art historian, educated and grown up in France, and understands those things from the points of view that form the dynamics of art worlds, of curatology, of museum direction, all of those kinds of things. Well, at this point, we're very much, whether we want to be or not, the trajectory of our histories of what we've all tried to do have resulted in very, as far as I'm concerned, positive things, and yet there's a lot more work to be done, lots more,
So maybe that, I love the sentiment you just said. Maybe we end with this slide and talk a little bit about what you said, which I think is, I won't say it as beautifully as you did, but that I think we need to understand our history in order to move forward, in order to look to shape a new and different future. So could you talk a little bit about the present slide?
Sure. So the images of these slides are one set of visualizations for the development of an idea that we've referred to as a memorial park in Shako Bottom. And so Shako Bottom, when we say that in terms of the memorial park, the struggle was to reclaim the African burial ground, but also to prevent sort of the standard inappropriate development of that area, because we were just learning the significance of that site to Richmond history. And when you were talking about the fact that you came here and you couldn't see the Black history of Richmond in its landscape, that becomes the centerpiece or the thrust of why this became such important work, was that not only was this history, this particular history of this cemetery and Gabriel's Rebellion something you couldn't see, but Shako Bottom itself was where Richmond was born. And Richmond was born through commerce and trade. And that trade, one of the trades that became so significant was the trade in human beings and that labor force. And so as that city grew, in particular in the 19th century, this is where it becomes what we refer to as the epicenter of the domestic slave trade as it built up over the 30 years leading to and through the Civil War, right on up to the last day of the war in Richmond in 1865. And so if Richmond, as the capital city of what was considered such an important state in the region of, Virginia, but also, in relation to sort of the founding of the country, Thomas Jefferson, that we have all these leading sort of founding figures whose political thought and social thought go into the making of this place, Richmond particularly. Right after the Revolutionary War, this becomes the capital of Virginia. So all of that lives in Shockoe Bottom, along with the ways in which Black life, comes here and then carves its way into the city and into the making of the city of Richmond along with it. And yet we couldn't tell or see any of that. This is the place where the economics of that social structure played out, and yet we can't see any of that, but we can see the evidences of all those other thoughts. So the reclamation and the conversion of this site into a site for public, actually I like the way you put it, is the landscape is a museum. Like the cities are a museum of its histories, and we are trying to turn this into the site itself a museum of those histories. And by museum, we're not talking about a single building, we're talking about the fact that it's the landscape itself that tells that story, and therefore the landscape itself that in a way needs to tell us how we are going to transform it into, a cultural resource that can be intentionally used in various ways. We're fortunate that after 20 years of, not necessarily knowing that that was the goal, that we are in a master planning process for the development of this area, and yeah. And to understand that, I'm sitting here, Phil's sitting here, we're talking about our newspaper and our work, is that we have, in many ways, really kind of been a vehicle for other people as well. We have been a support to other people who have been doing, trying to, do this work and other work in the city like this. And when you start talking about the shift in the landscape, we in our newspaper back in 2007, which I think because it was the anniversary, I forgot now, is it Robert E. Lee's 200th anniversary? What was it? The 200th anniversary of his birth. And in that year, there was, I don't know, was it $400,000 that was spent to clean the statue? 400? 450,000, right. So $450,000 were spent to clean that statue and make it presentable for his 200th birthday. And yet, we are talking about all of these other challenges in the city that are not getting that kind of sort of fiscal attention, but also the fact that here we are polishing a statue to a man who fought to preserve a way of life that was founded on slavery, which they articulated very plainly and consistently was indispensable to their way of life. And so so we complained at that point. It was in the newspaper. We got kicked out of a few different locations because we dared to be unhappy with Robert E. Lee. But a few years later, okay, it's too long a story,
no,
right?
But I'm interested in the dates only because I have my own timeline in my head of feeling that kind of feeling shift. And it seemed like around the sesquicentennial, similar, yes. I can't pronounce it.
Yeah.
It felt like that was when I started to feel it. I know that you were doing so much work previously that led to it, but as far as like the sort of plates shifting and
right.
Yeah. Would you say that 2011 was there?
I think it's as good a year as any. I think what I was really kind of trying to say is that, it wasn't only us. There are lots of people working on lots of aspects of it, but clearly the time was right because 2011, I mean, what that did on a Virginia-wide scale and to a lesser degree around the country is that was the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And locally, folks decided that we needed to also talk about it also being the 150th anniversary of emancipation when you cover the full 4 years of the war and then the 13th Amendment following that, right? So in 2011, a group of cultural institutions decided to call themselves the Future of Richmond's Past, and then planned programming, coordinated programming involving 19 institutions, including the museums and universities, in order to sort of coordinate telling the history of the Civil War over the course of that anniversary in a fundamentally different way than it had been done for the centennial back in 1961 to 1965, which in the middle of the civil rights movement and the height of the Dixiecrats, pushback was exactly what you would think it would be in that period. The lost cause lived large and high in that. So in that period, there is momentum and funding and political will that is beginning to shift, and we do begin to see things happening, because of that. And in 2000, I think it was 2011 that the asphalt came off of the burial ground. So that area there, the green space there, was all parking lot. Until May of 2011. There was a civil disobedience that took place, coordinated by the defenders in April, and then they had planned not to remove it until after the fiscal year began, and we said, okay, you can have your fiscal year, but this needs to come down now. And as a result, they did at least close it in May, and then shortly, May 24th, there was sort of an asphalt breaking ceremony, and then the asphalt was all removed and grass was laid down. So visually for the city, that was a big moment.
That's what I remember. That's sort of the moment. Driving daily down Shockoe Bottom and up, that was it felt like a very big moment. So thank you.